Today on CityCast DC, is the fat lady singing for the Kennedy Center? The Washington National Opera announced this month that it was leaving the newly MAGA-fied institution. It's the most shocking departure yet since Donald Trump's takeover, and it could spell enormous changes for both the center and the opera, as well as for Washington's status as a high-culture city. The Washington Post's Philip Kennicott has been covering the chaos, and he's here to explain. Today is Wednesday, January 21st. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC's talking about. Philip Kennicott, welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad to have you. And I think we've got some news that the Washington National Opera is leaving the Kennedy Center. We've now had almost a year of stories about one artist or another canceling a show and a controversy ensuing. This feels different to me. Why does it feel different?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I can still remember the days when Washington cultural news never made it past the Beltway. And now it really feels like we're at the center of the storm because the current administration is focusing on culture and the arts as a venue for pushing their ideas about America. And one of the central places of conflagration right now is the Kennedy Center. The Washington National Opera has performed at the Kennedy Center for more than 50 years.
So basically since the place was born.
Basically, since the place was born. They're a little older than the Kennedy Center, but as soon as they had a venue of that grandeur, they moved there, and they've been there with only, I think, a season or two when they were doing renovations have they been outside of the Kennedy Center. Up until very, very recently, meaning up until the president decided to change the name of the Kennedy Center, they were pretty committed to staying at the Kennedy Center despite boycotts and despite a lot of distress among their main patrons. When the name was announced, very shortly after that, they gave this shocking announcement that they're going to leave and they're going to try and perform the rest of their current season outside at other venues. And they're going to look for a future that isn't tethered to the Donald Trump, John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts.
So let me break this down a bit because, so much of the conversation about the Kennedy Center is about sort of culture war stuff. But there was nobody objecting to, Puccini, Verdi. What the opera has said is that they were taking a hit at the box office from the controversy and ill will around the Kennedy Center. And there's also this change in which the center is requiring for productions to be pre-funded. And that, they said, is incompatible with running an opera where you need to make up your investment in the by selling a lot of tickets. Can you explain a little bit about the economic components of this?
Sure. And I think it's smart to distinguish the usual kind of symbolic and content issues that affect these sort of questions. Is the art American or anti-American? Is it offensive to community sensibilities? These have been the standard things that have led to conflicts between government and arts in the past. But what's happening here is that the change to the Kennedy Center made it toxic to a lot of the people who buy the tickets and who donate to the center. And there's a very effective boycott right now that's impacting not just the National Opera, but the National Symphony as well. Donors didn't want to go into the building. And when Trump put his name on it, many of those who were wavering, who were saying, well, let's try and stick it out and hope for, change for the better, maybe a new administration, maybe we'll hold our nose and go into the Kennedy Center. But when he put his name on it, that was a step too far for many of those people who were wavering. And you began to see cancellations. You began to see cancellations also of artists who may be really important to groups like the Washington National Opera continuing to function. So the composer, Stephen Schwartz, for example, who was going to be leading a fundraiser, he pulled out. That was probably the tip of the iceberg in terms of what they were hearing behind the scenes. And that means, how do you get musicians? How do you get singers? All of that created a huge range of problems. You asked about the finances, and we ought to go a little bit deeper into that. If people aren't buying tickets, you're probably also losing donors. So you're taking a double hit. You're taking a hit in terms of filling the seats and paying for each individual performance. You're taking a hit in the long run in terms of money coming in to support the bigger costs and go into your endowment. What had happened at the Kennedy Center was the leader, a guy named Rick Grinnell, who's a kind of longtime Trump operative, had said that the new model was everything had to pay for itself up front. They weren't going to put on art that was losing money.
Isn't that the whole point of having a cultural center?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason we call them nonprofit arts institutions. It's not because they're designed to lose money. It's because they will inevitably lose money, but they have means of recouping that through donations and through sponsorship. But they don't do that necessarily up front. They don't say that every single opera is paid for before opening night curtain goes up. There's a long process of doing that. Donations come in over the year, and often what they do is they balance the losses versus the popular works. So West Side Story is really popular. It's going to sell out probably. And that may provide money that can then be diverted to an opera that may be a little more obscure, a little harder to sell. And in the end, what that does is gives the company a lot of artistic freedom to span a range of works and to appeal to a range of different tastes.
Don't miss Folger Theater's 4th annual Reading Room Festival on stage January 22nd through the 25th at the Folger Shakespeare Library. Join us as we collaboratively re-envision Shakespeare's works, explore the vibrant musicality of Shakespeare's verses, and reimagine the stories crafted by other early modern playwrights in this 4-day festival of staged readings, panel discussions, workshops, and community celebrations. This year's lineup features works from Alexa Babakania, Alberto Bonilla, Barbara Fuchs, and Marcus Gardley, with Arena Stage's artistic director, Hannah S. Sharif, directing one staged reading. Celebrate the spirit of collaborative theater making and community with the Folger. Enjoy all the festival has to offer for only $125 by purchasing an all-access pass at folger.edu/readingroom. Get yours today.
And I know I've heard from someone I know who's a musician that the number of times when they've always gotten these emails that go around every now and then. Hey, we haven't sold enough tickets for such and such. Does anybody want to go? And all employees can go for free. And you can take 2 tickets or 4. That the number of these emails going around has increased. There's so many more of them than there have ever been. And instead of saying you can take 2 or 4, they're saying take as many as you want, which is all indications that they're not selling enough tickets. And if your sort of regular Kennedy Center, gray-haired Washingtonian subscriber is less inclined to buy tickets, that is going to really hit the whole center's bottom line. And I guess that makes them even more likely to impose this kind of policy on the opera.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the boycott is effective. We don't know how effective at this point because we're not getting any clear answers from the center about its current finances. We get numbers kind of tossed out on social media and in interviews, but we really don't know how effective that's been. The Washington Post did a story last fall where we looked at the center's own ticket sales websites in terms of what seats were available each night for a particular performance and credit card data, credit and debit card data. And we found that they were selling about half of what they were doing before. So every night, 43% on average of the seats were unsold. A usual night before this all happened, that might be around 93%. So that's a huge difference, and that's a huge loss of money. I've heard the same thing about comping the house. My social media feed is full of people who regularly go to the Kennedy Center, who work at the Kennedy Center, who belong to organizations like the Opera Orchestra and the National Symphony. And they're saying, yeah, you might occasionally get the offer of 2 free tickets and you give them to a friend or a really passionate opera lover. Now they're getting 8 tickets a night. And it's coming not as a sort of, here are 8 tickets, go ahead. It's like, we need to fill a house. Comping the house is an age-old practice, and there's a really good reason behind it. It's just kind of dreary for a musician to go out there and perform to empty seats. You want people there. And comping the house can be a great way to get new people through the doors as well. But if you're comping, you know, half the house every night, you're going to be losing a lot of money every day.
So one of the things that struck me about the opera's exit is that the pattern that has emerged since Rick Grinnell was put in place, since Trump's takeover, has been some artist will cancel, and then the Kennedy Center and its leader will flame this artist as, look at you, you woke elitist, you refuse to you've refused to perform before a crowd who doesn't share your politics. That didn't happen this time. The opera said, this Kennedy Center said, well, it's time to separate, and they say they'll bring in some, I guess, foreign or out of town operas. What do you think explains that response?
That's a really interesting question. My sense is that this is more embarrassing to the center, the current leadership of the center, than any of the individual artist cancellations before. It's a lot easier to say, "Oh, Doug Verone, a choreographer, he's somehow a liberal guy," because people don't necessarily, widely know his work. He's a popular, choreographer among the dance crew. But the Washington National Opera has been around for decades. It's got a wide constituency. It's been part of the center since almost the beginning of the center. It's really fundamental to the center's identity. For it to leave, that's a pretty big, potato rotting in the middle of the room. You know what? If the host of the table gets up and leaves, there's a big question. If the guy at the far end of the table gets up and leaves, you may not notice it. So this is a bigger symbolic problem for them.
And the departure was so close in time to the renaming of the center. Based on your reporting or people has that? We don't have data yet, but has that led to like a further dramatic drop off in ticket sales or pledges?
From what I've seen, mainly in terms of the cancellations, it has been a really, really powerful impact, unfortunately. And right now that's creating huge problems for organizations like the National Symphony. One thing that happens when a boycott begins is that they tend to have a snowballing effect. And there's a lot of social and peer pressure that's going to come to bear as well. The artist Bela Fleck, a wonderful banjo player, he's left. That's going to give cover as well as put pressure on a lot of other artists to sort of think about the same set of questions he was thinking about. My sense is that when Trump put his name on the center, a kind of dam broke, and that there will be a cascade of cancellation and a tidal wave of financial losses.
And the unanswered question is what happens to the National Symphony Orchestra, which is the house orchestra of the Kennedy Center. Is that a relationship that could be imperiled by this?
That's a really problematic one. So there's a difference between the National Symphony Orchestra and the Washington National Opera. The Washington National Opera performed at the Kennedy Center, but they weren't technically part of the Kennedy Center until fairly recently. I think it was 2011. I'm going to have to check that fact. I don't have it in front of me. So they performed at the Kennedy Center for decades, but they weren't officially part of the Kennedy Center until they had some financial issues a few years back. And then they created an agreement whereby they joined the center so that they could kind of share functions, but they didn't join it in quite the same way as the National Symphony, which has been embedded in the center. It's really basically part of the center. It's really hard to distinguish the two organizations. So for them to leave legally, it's a much more complicated thing to do. For them to leave just practically to find a venue where they can perform and rehearse 4 or 5, 6 days of the week, that's going to be really complicated. That just doesn't exist out there. The Washington National Opera can rehearse in one space and then perform in another, and they only need it for maybe 8 or 10 days, that kind of thing. They may be able to find places to perform. It's really hard to imagine where the National Symphony goes. And it's really also much, much more difficult to figure out how they would disentangle themselves from the center legally. So they're in a much more problematic situation.
But look, there's also hanging out there, as I understand it, there's a number of union contracts that are about to come up. My sense is that the current leadership are not particularly keen on organized labor in the first place. But even if they were, when you're talking about a situation that has led to like really dramatic reduction in the amount of money coming in the door at a place where the federal contribution only covers the physical plant, what is likely to happen with some of these contract negotiations? Are we going to start to see strikes?
I don't know if those strikes will be motivated by the politics of the
No,
situation.
they'll be monitored by the money. If the center doesn't have money, then they're not going to be giving the raises that I would imagine a union negotiator would want.
Look, I mean, to put it really bluntly, the center can destroy the orchestra if they want to. It's fairly easy. And it's precisely through those sort of mechanisms, like paying the musicians. They've got a lot of control ultimately over the National Symphony, which is why you see the symphony in a very difficult place and being very cautious about things. So, as an example, Rick Grinnell said that they're now going to play the national anthem before every single National Symphony Orchestra concert, which is kind of ridiculous. No slight the national anthem, but there is a long-standing custom that you play the national anthem at the beginning of the season. It's a sense of occasion, and it's kind of a big deal. Now they're doing it before every performance, and they're going to auction off the rights to conduct it. And it all, to symphony people, it just feels sort of silly and, well, kind of vulgar. But that's the kind of leverage he's got. And you're right, contract negotiations are another. One of the things that's not often discussed in all of this, because it seems maybe a small thing compared to the bigger political crisis we're in, but the National Symphony Orchestra is in a really, really good place artistically right now. It sounds better than they have in more than a quarter century. Um, they have been building an orchestra that I think is in the top ranks of American orchestras. I was in Chicago recently and New York not long before, and went to the Philharmonic and the Chicago Symphony. The National Symphony Orchestra is playing better than both orchestras. That's phenomenal. Unfortunately, it happened at a time when we're not paying as much attention to orchestras, and when the attention is now kind of on the politics of all this. That's a long way of saying that if the center wants to hurt the orchestra, they can destroy it artistically as well. Younger players, the great players, the ones that they've been, who've been building up the ranks of the orchestra, they can take new jobs. They can go and perform with other orchestras, and we'll end up with a second-rate orchestra. That'll be collateral damage, but it's significant collateral damage.
And I got to say, as just as a Washingtonian, I am not a big symphony goer, but I like the idea of being in a city that has of being from a city that has a world-class symphony, a world-class opera company, where a erudite critic like yourself is comparing us to the top companies in the country, and that seems like a piece of potential collateral damage in the mix too. The idea that can Washington, without a Kennedy Center, be the sort of city that could sustain this type of excellence?
The nation's capital should have a significant cultural base. And it should be a broad cultural base. It's not just symphony orchestras. It should be across the board. But if you look back to the origins of the Kennedy Center, really comes out of the Cold War, and it comes out of that Cold War emulation between the East and the West, between Russia and the United States. The idea that we could be equal to Europeans when it came to dance, when it came to opera, when it came to classical music. That feels a little passé to people right now, but I don't think we should sacrifice that too blithely, too easily, because it takes a long time to build up those institutions, and we will never recreate them. So if Grinnell manages to break the National Symphony Orchestra, no one's going to come in and create another world-class symphony. It just won't happen. It'll be gone. And you can say, well, we don't really need it. It's not really fundamental to American culture. But, who knows? Who knows what music is going to matter in 5 years or 10 years? And when we have moments of great national trauma and pain, very often it is the orchestras. It is classical music that people actually turn back to. In the same way that when a president leaves the office, we make a painting of him. We turn back to these supposedly antiquated forms for the depth of symbolism that's been embedded in them over centuries.
So what I think I hear you saying, because I was going to ask you about next steps and sort of what are the things to look for next, but maybe I'll pivot. Like, is this? It sounds like you're describing a sort of moment of existential threat to the very existence of a kind of high culture palace in Washington that can sustain culture.
Yeah, I think we're at that moment, and I've argued with a lot of people on social media about trying to distinguish between, say, the National Symphony and the Opera and the current politicized leadership of the center. Um, I'm not making much traction. I'm not the only one making that argument. The symphony's making that argument, and some members of the orchestra are making that argument.
Well,
Um,
wait, make it to me. Like, if you are faced with someone who says, you know, I'm going to cancel my National Symphony tickets, I'm done, I'm not setting foot in that place again, what do you say to them to convince them otherwise?
I say that when you protest, you need to take that protest to the places that it's effective, to the actual source of the problem, and to a source of possible remedies. Donald Trump doesn't care about the National Symphony Orchestra. You're not causing him any sleepless nights by not buying tickets. What you're doing is putting the National Symphony Orchestra out of business, and they are not at this point. Um, Entirely under the thumb of the Kennedy Center. I know I just said that Brunel can cause them enormous damage. He can probably put them out of business. He can humiliate them. But so far, they are artistically independent, and they're doing the same thing that they've been doing for decades now. There's not an impact on the messaging. A lot of people will say there's a famous example of a conductor named Furtwängler, who was the leader of the Berlin Philharmonic, and he was the guy who made completely the wrong decision at the wrong moment when Hitler was in power, and he chose to stay with the orchestra as they were purging their Jewish members. This is a stain on his legacy that has never been washed away. And even though he left behind incredible recordings, there are a lot of people who just will not listen to them. And it's understandable. This guy failed at a moment of moral imperative. People are phrasing the current question of the National Symphony in that same all or nothing kind of moral imperative. It may get to that point if they're performing concerts in honor of Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is standing in the presidential box being feted by the National Symphony, then yeah, we're there. That's not happened yet. What's happening now is that an organization that could easily go out of business is trying to figure out a way to survive until a new administration comes in. And the choice for ticket buyers is, do they aid and abet that destruction? Or do they support an organization holding their nose even because the landlord is somebody they don't like?
Do you make a similar argument for other types of shows at the Kennedy Center? Should people, I mean, if you encounter someone who says, you know, I'm not going to buy a show for, I'm sorry, I'm not going to buy a ticket for this traveling Broadway show that's at the Kennedy Center because I don't want to support the place, what do you say to them?
Well, so first of all, I have to be a little careful about what I say to you right now because I'm not in the business of organizing boycotts. My employer, I think, would take a very dim view of that.
I'm just asking you to weigh the ethics of it. I've so stipulated that most reporters can't organize anything to save our lives.
There's a distinction between the shows and the artists being brought in by the current leadership of the center and the organizations like the symphony and the opera that didn't ask to be a part of this big fiasco. Um, Not buying a ticket to a show that's being presented by the Kennedy Center is sending a very clear message to the Kennedy Center leadership. Not buying a ticket to the National Symphony Orchestra is sending a much more complicated message, mainly to people who are not going to receive it, like the president.
And what about people like Bella Fleck who pull out? Are they doing the right thing? I mean, the center itself does sustain damage, which is going to be felt by the symphony and by the opera and so on when A-list talent pull out.
It's true, and it's almost impossible to imagine the Kennedy Center going bankrupt, but it is possible to imagine that, and it's hard to know what would become of that. Um, I would not have thought a year ago that Donald Trump would take over the Kennedy Center. I would have not thought a half a year ago they would put his name on it. I would not have thought a few months ago that the Kennedy Center might become simply a personal venue for people loyal to Donald Trump. I think that's possible. In which case, sending a message to the center, I think, probably is important. I don't believe they're going to hear it. And I don't believe that these are people who can acknowledge that they've made mistakes or have done damage. They simply move on. They will blame this on other things, other events. They'll blame it on woke culture, and we'll end up potentially with a Kennedy Center that is simply a bunch of empty presentation boxes for Christian Bible events and Republican retreats and FIFA, the World Cup draw, and the kinds of entertainment that appeal to Donald Trump and his people.
Before I let you go, people who aren't going to Kennedy Center shows, they are presumably spending their money somewhere. Do you have any sense from your reporting that other venues in Washington, whether we're talking theater or classical music or what have you, are seeing increased interest or are in a position to do more interesting things than they might otherwise have been?
So I think there is evidence right now that people are investing and going to other organizations. And that can be a boon locally for arts institutions that have lived in the shadow of the Kennedy Center. Local theater groups, smaller orchestras, smaller opera companies, and they do exist. And that's a great thing. I mean, one of the problems of the Kennedy Center, a problem that we might have put in the foreground 5 years ago, 10 years ago, would be, wait a second, is this good for the larger ecosystem of the arts in Washington? The answer to that would have been, it's a double-edged sword. It's good for a lot of things, but it has some negative downsides to it. Right now, it's clearly good for these smaller groups because people need art. They need to go to things, and they are. I'm seeing that not just in terms of ticket sales, but I'm seeing that anecdotally on social media. Um, but it's also hard to imagine the Washington arts ecosystem without the Kennedy Center. It may have sucked up a lot of the resources and a lot of the audiences, um, but there is no other institution comparable to it. And there's no other institution in the performing arts that puts us on the stage at a national or world-class level.
Phil, this has really been great. But by the way, we've been talking this whole time about the Kennedy Center, and that is what I'm going to call it, and that's what like most people I interact with call it. You work at a paper that has a copy desk and copy rules. What do you guys officially call it? And is anybody in a sort of formal capacity using the new name?
So at this point, the Washington Post is still calling it the Kennedy Center. And it's my understanding that we'll continue to call it the Kennedy Center until it's actually legally renamed by the entity which created that name and has the authority to change it, which is Congress.
Is anybody using the new name?
Well, I saw Rick Grinnell being interviewed on
Right.
the PBS NewsHour, and it was interesting that he used the new name, but he couldn't quite get it consistently. So a couple times he had to back up and add the Trump in after saying Kennedy Center. It's funny to look at like the history of National Airport, Reagan National Airport, who does it. I still say National. I can't get Reagan to come out my mouth, but I think I'm kind of antiquated in that regard. Younger people probably just call it Reagan.
Yeah, I'm like you, but I've just started saying DCA because nobody objects to that. I wonder if there's a Kennedy Center equivalent of that. Do they have 3-letter codes in the worlds of symphonies and operas?
I don't think so.
Alas.
But if only opera companies and symphonies were as essential to the civic infrastructure as airports, they probably would.
Phil, thank you so much for being here, my friend.
Same. It's always enjoyable. I had fun.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and for heaven's sake, subscribe to our morning newsletter. And if you like shows like this one, please become a CityCast neighbor. You can do that at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.